Hello, world. Welcome to the Pocket Gamer podcast with me, Brian Baglow, and my awesome co host, the mobile maven herself, Miss Peggy and Salz. Good afternoon, Peggy. How are you today?
I am good today, Brian, and you are looking really fine, I have to say. You have been out again doing what I think is the coolest thing you do, other than, of course, co-host this with me, is you are out there championing the games industry. Tell me about it. What's going on?
Well, I was invited to a launch this morning at STV. That's one of the big broadcasters here in Scotland, and their children's charity are really interested in working with us for Scottish Games Week to help support children in poverty across the country. And obviously, video games and kids are kind of like, even more than kids and candy these days, a route that they're not really familiar with. So I've been going through, speaking to a lot of sports stars, politicians, trustees, the great and the good about how video games work, what we could potentially do to sort of raise money, and how they can tap into this huge global market to help children at every age across the whole of the country. So I thought I better look my best. So if you're listening to this in audio only, I'll look. Basically Daniel Craig as James Bond, only sharper.
It's a look, Brian. Keep it. And yeah, you said you were talking to the best and the brightest. I wouldn't quite want to bring it in there as a segue, but I will do it anyway because we do have someone who is at that level because of the impression that they have of the industry, the perspective of the industry, and sharing it with us. Because when you're a company this big and you share what you're seeing, that's what we have to tune in for. So, our guest today is Daniel Tchernahovsky. He is president of Global Business Development and responsible for AppLovin's customer facing business globally and also gaming advertiser growth. So, those are the two big areas. Really impressive. We're going to talk about trends, but when he's not focused on growing game studios, helping them achieve profitable growth, well, he's also involved in growth of another kind. And I think you, Brian, considering your new role in life as the father of 5 happy Labrador puppies, you will appreciate this. Indeed, you will appreciate this because he's focused on growth of another kind because his daughter was just recently born. So, congratulations, Daniel, and great to have you.
Thank you very much. That's quite an intro. Very nice to be here.
As Peggy said, we are at the exciting intersection of two different approaches to games: ad-driven games and the ones with strong IP that know how to monetize player engagement. And they were really quite separate, but now they're kind of morphing, merging, and dare I say, converging together. Is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is, and that's kind of a nice part about working for a network such as ourselves. Peggy already mentioned it. You do kind of see everything. You talk to a lot of clients, and we very much see it being something that companies have desired to do for a while. And it's now over the last year and a half, it's taken fruition. I think if you look at the charts, you see more and more games as such. We also see that these combined buying strategies, when you try to buy users that are both ad and IP revenue generating, they're the fastest growing types of UA, types of growth that we see on the platform. So it's definitely something that we see as well. And to be fair, it's probably one of the key drivers of growth for the industry as a whole. Because if you think about it, a lot of games that don't have ads today, by creating ads, they will allow other games to grow, and that grows the whole pie as well. So definitely very much something that we're seeing.
And also the acceptance. I'm seeing also more research out there that it's more like this is the way it is. So a blended approach, we will accept ads. We will also accept, of course, rewarded ads, even more so, but we will accept ads as part of the experience if it's balanced. That's the key.
For sure. I mean, the truth is that people are playing games for different purposes, right? Obviously, a lot of these games were historically designed with the hope that somebody's going to spend money. But the reality is 95% of people don't, and you still want to provide engagement and entertainment for these people. And historically, I think we're in a market where people would say, look, I'm going to monetize the 5%, I'm going to enjoy the other 95. And I think now companies are becoming more creative in monetizing that audience in a reward. Basically, you give an exchange, right? You don't just watch an ad for the sake of watching an ad. You get something in exchange, and I think that mechanism has been very widely and positively accepted by the audience.
we see a lot on the website. We see a lot in the news stories about the growing importance of hybrid monetization. You know, it's all more than a trend; it's a mega trend, and it's your job to kind of see these high level trends coming and look around the corners at what's next. Um, would you have called this a year ago?
Well, let's put it this way. I think from talking to clients, we knew that where we are today is somewhere where they wanted to be. It would have been hard to predict that it would have been this successful, but it's certainly something that people aspire to. And the truth is, there's a good reason, right? Like if you think about hybrid, you're coming from two sides. You have the IP world that is trying to monetize the audience that might not be spending money, and we'll talk about that probably later. But you also have, I think, hybrid today most commonly is referring to ad revenue games that have now started to implement IP, right? So it's kind of coming from both sides. And frankly, particularly for the ones that are coming from the ad revenue side, there was a business necessity. Like some of these businesses, to survive, to continue growing, they had to create these types of engagements because otherwise the market was just becoming very, very competitive.
Is that just really all back to ATT, IDFA, all of that, or is it something more foundational? I'm always asking this question of marketers because it's like for them, this was more important when we talk about the new normal. It wasn't post pandemic; it was post IDFA. So it was dramatic and traumatic. But is that a core reason, or is it something more?
It's kind of like basic economy. Like the more competition you have, the smaller your margins become, the more you have to innovate. I think this is something that we've seen very much in the gaming market as well. You're 100% right. ATT was a headwind for many, particularly for the IP side of the world, because they were quite heavily relying on the Facebooks and Googles that were most impacted. Um, on the ad revenue side, ATT wasn't as much of an effect. I think what was happening is, if you guys think back on hyper casual games, right? Like, what was it really? Hyper casual game wasn't a fully fledged game per se. What it was a concept and a mechanism of which you test hundreds and see which one has the lowest possible CPI to get an audience, monetize it in a day or two, and then they'll play the next game, right? But the more people enter, the more companies enter that market, the harder it was to A, find a really outstanding concept, but also B, games were copied quicker. And obviously, there are only so many ways you can swipe a finger on a phone, right? Like there is a limitation mechanisms that you have. So innovating on that became harder and harder. And a lot of these businesses were at the point where they were potentially creating a lot of revenue, but they weren't actually generating that much profit from a user. So they felt a need to try to increase it. And obviously, that goal exists from the beginning, but you need knowledge and expertise to build actually really engaging games. And I think that's what a lot of these businesses have been working on for the last 2 years or so. Also out of necessity, to be honest.
We do have that shift because we have companies like Voodoo that was hyper casual, right? They're going into casual. Our good friend John Wright over at Quali also quoted recently saying, hey, I don't know if we want to go that far, but hyper casual's ship has sailed. So they're looking at casual. So it seems that in the scheme of things, maybe you couldn't have called it a year ago, but the trend was already well in process.
For sure. I think when you're in that position, when you have these businesses that you have a bunch of resources, you now have at parts like Voodoo has billions of installs, right? Of course, you have a back catalog that will be there forever, but effectively, if a majority of your games really engages a user for a day or two, maybe three, many of these hyper casual games had you say like a day seven retention of 5%. So most users are effectively gone, right? So there's only so much engagement that you can get from users. There's only so much of monetization and experience that you can provide for these users. So naturally, the goal was always to build something bigger. It's just early on it was cheaper. Like building a quick concept and scaling it was relatively cheap, right? Like building a quick, easy game takes a week, costs a couple K, and off you go. Now that that's no longer available, every company, whether it's Voodoo, Say Games, Homa, Rollick, all of these companies now have games. Sometimes actually even games that were hyper casual games themselves. Mob Control is a good example of that, where they just added to in a hyper casual game mechanics that really extended it into something new.
The hybrid monetization, as I say, we write about this a lot, but there still seems to be a little, I'm going to say, resistance from some developers that I find perplexing because surely now, if you are building you have multiple ways of making money, it becomes part of your design. It's putting more power into the hands of the developers, not less. It's not taking anything away from you. It's just forcing you to be more creative around how your game makes money, and building a value into your engagement. How are you finding the response from developers?
So this is the interesting part. On the one hand, you have the hyper casual, let's call it, formerly hyper casual audience who had no complaints about it because it was always the desire, but they might have needed more time and expertise to build it. On the other hand, you have these IP businesses, and let's be honest. Obviously, of course, there's a Monopoly Go that comes up every couple of years, but some of the most successful big IP titles that exist in the world have been around for many years. Playrix has been in the charts for 10, 12 years. Dream Game has now been around for 3, 4 years. Like, these businesses are there for a very long time. And obviously there is, I wouldn't call it confirmation bias per se, but you're incredibly successful with what you're doing. Why risk it? And I think there are two perceptions that go into it. Like, I've talked to many founders, developers, whoever it may be in these IP businesses, who sometimes have still this idea of ads being a muddying of the quality, like a really, like in console, you would say an AAA. An AAA title doesn't have ads, right? The truth is, users want the experience. Users want to engage with them. It's not like you're forcing an interstitial into them. Most of these games actually are going into the rewarded direction. But that's certainly been one major concern. And the other one has also been that there is a fear of cannibalization. Now, that fear is very, very justified. But of course, if you give a user all the possible rewards, why would they spend the money? So fine tuning it is not easy. And really what it requires is dedication. And we've seen a shift in that dedication over the last couple of years. Like, companies have to prioritize the work, otherwise they won't do it, right? And that's happening now.
What is it then that has to be done in a studio to do this properly? Is it different skills? Is it different people? Because this is a different monetization model. It's built on the ones we know, but it's also very different. What will get studios here, there in the future?
Again, I think we have to differentiate the two sides because it's kind of different skill sets required. But let's talk about the IP side first, because I think that's the one that has, say, historically been most hesitant towards it. I don't actually think, in our experience, that it is a question of capabilities. Obviously, you need big sets of data. This is the one thing that maybe separates a Playrix or a King versus an up and coming Match 3 company. These guys have millions of downloads, and they can go into their data and identify patterns of behavior that indicate whether somebody's going to be a purchaser, right? Like, the simplest thing you say, if somebody progresses through the first 5 levels in X hours and they only use one buster, maybe, or like one bonus, maybe they won't do IP. But if they're already there, use 3, maybe they will, right? Obviously, it's a simplification, but the more data you have, the more easy you will discover these patterns. So they had the data available, but I think it's a question of prioritization. The feedback that we heard a lot was, look, I can work on a new IP event, and that's going to increase my LTV by 5%. Well, I can try to integrate ads, and at best, that gets me another 1 or 2%. I think these numbers are no longer accurate because there are companies out there. It's funny, I was talking to a developer the other day who suggests, and obviously I don't know this, but they're suggesting that King now is the largest ad revenue driver in the world. That they have integrated ads to an extent. And King for us is Candy Crush, it's these IP businesses, right? So I think you see more and more. King is a great example of it. I think Toon Blast and Toy Blast for Pika are also great examples. We have more and more proof cases in industry now. So, hey, this absolutely works. These companies are growing thanks to these technologies as well, thanks to these approaches. And I think that gives companies more confidence.
What do studios need to be successful at, really? And what's the main driver of their success now?
It has to happen in the right time of frame as well, because you can build all the segmentations in the world, but if you don't have tools that allow you to capture those audiences well, then the segmentation isn't that purposeful. We have to still keep in mind, like, for the majority of businesses in gaming, 60, 70%, 50 to 70%, let's say, of their expenses as a business is UA, is growth. So obviously companies are very much designing their apps, their content, with the perspective of, well, I'm going to have to spend money to get users. Of course, there are exceptions to the case. Like somebody like Supercell historically grew without it. But again, if we look at the big Monopoly Go, whether it's King, whether it's Playerix, whether it's Dream Peak, all these companies have significant UA cost. And if you think back about how you ran UA just a few years ago, it was pretty antiquated in a way. What you would do is you'd say, well, I'm buying from users from app A. So whenever you show an ad in app A, I'm willing to pay whatever it is, $2 per install or $3 per install. But the users that play app A could be anything, right? It could be an iPhone 15 user that has just spent €1,000 in another game, or it could be somebody on really old device that's never spent money. You don't know these things, but you target everyone as if they were the same quality. And this is an aspect where there's been really significant progress in our industry over the last couple of years. For ourselves, we called it Axon back then, where we kind of moved from the idea of you just target a source or an app to tell us what type of behavior you're seeking. Don't worry about it. We will find those users for you. And that kind of opened the door to more complexity, because now you're not just saying, this is how much I want to pay for a user. Now you're saying, hey, look, I have 4 or 5 different profiles of users that I'm looking for. With this profile of users, I'm looking for retention and engagement. With this profile of users, I'm looking for ad returns. With this type of user, I'm looking for IP returns in the first 7 days, right? You now have confidence that a growth partner like yourself, so others, can effectively bring you the users that behave in the way that you want them to behave. So now the task for the studios is to figure out, how would you like them to behave? Now, so that's basically the task that's on the studios now, but it's been enabled by the industry, I would say.
Thinking that through, do you have any thoughts, any advice, any non-negotiables on trying to figure out what a value player looks like for our audience to go back there and really think this through?
So the first step is always the game design itself, right? Before you actually get to the marketing side, you have to design games with the perception of there are different ways to engage with the product, right? You have to design a game, and I think most companies are doing this now, in a way where you might as well benefit from a user that is going slow and steady versus someone who's going super aggressive into the game, right? If you think of a match 3 game or a puzzle game, there are power users who like play 2 hours a day, and every time that there is a level they can't breach, they're going to spend money on those boosters and go through it. Sure, that is a type of user and behavior that you want to encourage, but there's the slow and steady as well. Maybe there's somebody who's going to, for the next 2 years, play every day for 20 minutes. Maybe they're never going to spend money on it, but if they watch one rewarded ad a day because you give them the one booster that they need to enjoy their day, you're going to be benefiting off that user as well. So the first step is design. Because really, IP, if you think, what is an IP? Today, we use IP to limit or increase progression. If you think about any way where you really spend money, is you have speed ups, boosters, all these things. They're really just a pace of progression that you will have for your product, right? So understanding that there are different types of progression is usually part one. But then part two is, once you understand that these different progressions exist, you have to judge everyone differently. So an easy thing that we see is, let's say somebody comes in and says, I want a day 7 return of 10% of my ad spend, right? I want day 7, 10% ROAS. And that is, in match 3, this is, for example, that's the metric that everyone aspires to, roughly 10 to 15%. But why would you ask for the same thing from these different users? They shouldn't have the same numbers by day 7, because they're going to behave completely differently from day 7 to year 1. So it's going back to the board and figuring out, how do these users progress? What are early indicators? What should I be looking for? Is a really big difference, right? So that's, I would say, that's a key and non-negotiable for every company that wants to be successful today, is you don't just optimize to one number anymore.
So let's put that into something actionable for a moment. What that could say is, just like in real investment world, right? Spread it. So you're not saying this is the ideal user. You're sort of saying, well, these are going to possibly be similar. So I will, I won't say nurture, because that sounds so cute and it sounds like it's not hard-headed business thinking, which it is. You're going to spread it and you're going to watch it evolve, and you're not going to go for just the one. It's I think what I'm hearing here.
I think that's very accurate. So if you look at, again, if we look at the way that partners work with us, back in the day, you ran one campaign with one target, one optimization, off you go. Today, as you have more complexity in your segmentation, as you have more complexity in your monetization, most companies with us will now run 3, 4 different campaigns. To give you an extreme example, there will be a game, there's like a hybrid puzzle game out there that is probably going to have one campaign where they pay $40 per install and another campaign where they pay $4 per install. They'll still be profitable on both, but the CPI could be 40 in one and 4 in another because it's two entirely different users, right? So that requires some confidence. That also requires some understanding of data, because if you're a hybrid developer that's used to 50-cent CPIs or $1 CPIs, and now you see a campaign that throws $40, your first reaction is panic. It's like, oh, I'll never make that money back. And then you learn how these users behave. You learn that this is an entirely different pattern, and you get comfortable with it. And that's actually a process that we've been seeing a lot over the last year plus.
Essentially, there's no one size fits all approach anymore.
Mhm.
Every game is individual. Every game from every developer is individual,
Yeah.
and every player is unique. It's the whole. I'm going to say hyper segmentation. I think is something
Yeah.
that people are just going to have to live with. We know data is valuable, but what you guys are saying is that it comes down to chasing every single player and
Yeah.
recognizing value from them, whether or not it's LTV,
Yeah.
CPI, or other. So again, I think it's one of these realities of working in the sector in 2024.
Yeah.
And is that it? Can developers just hope for the best and punt something out, or are those days long gone?
The truth is that patterns of behavior are a result of design. It's not like people will experience your products in a way that's entirely unintended to you, right? If you think about IP economies, you design them, you price them, you figure out what type of progression you want to limit and which one you want to speed up through these purchases. So it's very much something where developers are in the driver's seat. Um, but beyond it, I think we can stay away from overcomplication. So what I mean by that is, yes, every user behaves differently. However, you can, with enough data, you can bucket them in three, let's say three big groups. You have, in a hybrid model, you have people that spend a lot of money, you have people that watch a lot of ads, and you have people that engage a lot with the product and stay in it for a very long time. And actually, that's a simplification. But if you think again about business from the perspective of most of your expenses as a business are UA, and you have 3 or 4 types of getting users, then you just have to figure out these patterns. And I think the jump in thought process is, there is not necessarily such a thing as a bad user. Like, every user is profitable if you buy them for the right price, which means if you target them the right way. So easy example is, some of these really big IP companies are now running campaigns where they just want somebody who will cross level X, level 40 in the first 7 days. Because they know if somebody gets to that level in the first 7 days, they've engaged a lot with the product and they're going to play for the next 2 years, right? Um, that's something that I wouldn't call it new, but it is a change in thought process, and that's just amplified if you have varied monetization.
There's something interesting here, though, that's all about whether or not studios realize that they're only monetizing a small fraction of their audience, because the old model told them go after X result, not after an evolution track of players. So that's the realization. Um, where's the innovation in moving then studios to that, or enabling them to even start to do that?
Yeah, so I think the key parts of it are, on the one hand, you have just the fact that these companies are now going for it, that they see the best practices that are out there in the market. Uh, the technology that we just discussed obviously is a big driver as well. At the end of the day, you have now more tools available. To give you an example, right? You could now design a game in a way where, if you buy, you run a campaign to buy a user, and that campaign is optimizing towards in-app purchases. You send them on Apple to a custom product page. On Android, you will have the ad ID, and you can send them to a version of the game that won't show ads for the first 7 days, because you're now assuming that that user is going to be heavy IP monetized, right? Whereas you run another campaign that is ad revenue driven. So for those guys, you don't expect them to spend money, so you start showing them rewarded from day one, right? So you have these tools available, and there are helpful, but I do think that it all starts with the idea of developers who get behind and understand the upside that is out there for them, and tech providers like ourselves giving them the opportunity to actually manifest these ideas and segmentations into growth. I think those are the key drivers. But yes, obviously you have to commit to it.
A different game for every segment. Is that going to be challenging to manage? Because I mean, it's lovely for the player. We get what we want. That's awesome. But someone's also got to manage those. Manage those. Are they different builds? Maybe I'm missing something here.
No, not at all. So like the way to think of it is that you have, if you build a game, if you build an economy, you effectively have you have your level design. That's the easiest way of thinking of it, right? And then on top of it, you build your economy. So an easy example of it would be you play a match three game, and now the level difficulty is one thing, right? But then another aspect is before the start of the level, do I get a bomb or do I get two bombs? Do I have 20 passes to finish the level or 15? How many lives do I have? Like all these things are design choices that companies have available that will, at the end of the day, impact the progression. That's what we talked about before. At the end of the day, you build progression, you limit progression, you speed it up in relation to how the users want to engage with the product. That's certainly one thing. The other one is also the complexity, and that's actually something where we're seeing innovation now, which is really, honestly, it's pretty funky actually to see, is this idea of the game won't be the same for you and me. Let's say, Peggy, the two of us play a match three game. Why should the level two for you and me be the same? Based on how I behaved in level one, level two should look different. Now, you can take it a step further and say, let's say you match three, whatever, diamonds, and now there's a new row coming in. Should that whatever is in that row be the same for me and another person of the same complexity? Probably not, right? You can customize more and more because the goal really is to create experiences that feel tailored to you. You want a game experience where it feels this is just my level of difficulty. And that's something that we're seeing more. Like I've talked to companies who are saying they build literal ML models to use past behavior to decide what type of block or stone or whatever it is will come up next for every single user, and that they use to increase retention. Like it can go pretty deep.
How should they think about this? You know, we'll have developers listening who are used to, I build a game, the game gets published, end of story. You know, this is a bit of a mindset shift. So how should they be looking at this? How should they be thinking about this level of adaptivity for their players?
From a technological side, it doesn't require much change. The systems that you have server side changes. You can build the same app with a variety of, again, we talked about progression, with a variety of engagements. I think what it really requires is experimentation and data. And obviously, a lot of the companies today that are building aren't really building the first game. I think gaming is a somewhat matured market. So, like you can see, for example, Peak Games, we mentioned them before, they've now built a new game, a match game that's doing incredibly well, but they have experience from building games before. So obviously that plays a role, and you can look at past data and you can look at it in new ways. And I think this is where ML in particular, or really the assessment of big sets of data, has advanced a lot. Like you have companies now that are also service companies. You have service companies now that do LTV prediction based on custom behavior. You have companies now that do data segmentation, right? You have companies that help you with the analysis of these big chunks of millions and millions of users' data. Like game developers can use it, but I think what we've seen recently, to be honest, over the last year or so, is that the majority of hits come from repeat offenders. There are fewer companies out there that are net new to the gaming world and go 0 to 100. And oftentimes, actually, let's take Spike Games as an example. Spike Games is an incredibly successful Turkish company. It's former Peak users, former Peak founders, right? So you have all these people that are now building games have past experience that they can leverage.
So that's a great point, and leveraging data and leveraging, not only existing data but any of the games that you've worked on in the past is sounds as though it's absolutely vital. But what other smart approaches are marketers missing here? What could they be doing better? Where should they be putting their attention, their time, and more importantly, their money?
So it's funny that you mentioned money, because I think the way that you think of money is actually a pretty big aspect. What we're seeing is that companies that are more experimental tend to be more successful. So even if we just talk about money, let's take an easy example. Let's say you take 10% of your monthly budgets and you put it into experimentation, not into the beaten path of what you know should be successful, but 10% every month go into, let's try out this funky idea, let's try out this campaign type, let's try out these type of things. I think experimentation is one thing that is being done more and more now, but it's evolving. So that's definitely something that I would advise everyone to do. The other thing is, and that comes along with experimentation, is not to focus on one buying strategy. If your game allows, or if your product allows for a variety of player profiles of behaviors, try buying all of them, right? Try running a campaign that's optimizing towards IAP. Try running one that's optimizing towards retention. Try buying one that is optimizing towards maybe adverse if you have them. And sequentially think about every campaign on its own. So what I mean by that is, we mentioned briefly before that, everyone would say day 7, 10%. This is what everyone's targeting. But now, if we go one level further in granularity and we say, okay, my VO, IAP, ROAS campaigns, the ones that get these purchases in, every channel now has to buy 10% day 7. Well, that's also actually not the right approach, because maybe one channel is maturing better than the other channel, right? Maybe one channel grows better early on, the users they bring in, another one grows better after the fact. So the advice that I would always give, and what I'm seeing being implemented more and more, is really customizing your goal setting, your strategy to every channel, to every geo. In an ideal setup, you have every campaign that you run on every channel in every geo has a goal that is constantly updated based on past historic data, and doesn't per se have to be the same, right? So whenever I see somebody that says, well, I need my 10% day 7, if you don't hit that number, I'm unprofitable, that is no longer the case. And part of that function actually is also no longer focusing on CPI. I mentioned that example before of a company buying for $5 and for 50. It doesn't matter whether it's 5 or 50. At the end of the day, as a business, you spend money and you need a return for it. So whether you get for $1,000, you get 20 users or 200, as long as the return at the end is the same, it's somewhat secondary how many users you buy. So what you try to optimize for is making your profits, your returns, your margin for every profile of users. I think that is what sets the best companies apart from the ones who aspire to be them, is constant reassessment of goals, really deep segmentation, building predictions. That's the things that really make you an expert power user, let's say, in growth. Obviously, they require data. So there is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but that's the approaches that we see.
I was thinking the whole time you said 10%, and it's been the basic in the rest of the industry since I've been in it. So that's 20 years right there. Coming from the Coca-Cola, what was it? School of Excellence, wasn't it? It was 80/20. It was always 80/20. It was 80% stays the way it is, 20% you experiment. And that's why, Coke is one of those brands that we know that continually reinvents itself. So there's a lot of sense to that, but in that experimentation, there's a lot of pattern recognition. There's a lot of thinking beyond what we're seeing. And that's a great place. Doesn't have to be, but that is a great place where machine learning can look at the data and see the patterns. Gen AI can deliver the creatives that are going to work with those profiles. Is that what is needed, or is it something more? I mean, you want to sort of use it as a tool, but is it going to then therefore not be a point of differentiation anymore when we all use it?
I've experienced this firsthand, by the way, working for growth business. The smarter the systems became, the less useful I really became, because I have no buttons to hit anymore. You set a campaign. So from 5 years ago, where I was working with companies and trying to figure out the best way to use the system, we now move to being more advisors to their businesses of how to grow it and what to focus on, right? So similarly, yes, it is true. In a world where you automate everything, you won't have a competitive edge in the long run from the tools that you use. So it will come down to the content. At the end of the day, and we're seeing this time and time again in the top charts, is the better your product, the more successful you're going to be, right? If you have a product that is 30% higher in LTV than every competitor, you will be okay even if you don't squeeze out the last 5% of your UA, right? So product rules in an environment where you have channels that can support that growth, right? So luckily, whether it's ATT or others, the industry has been always very good in overcoming these challenges. And today there is a functioning growth mechanism that exists for these businesses. So yeah, the focus will always be on the content first. But 100% there are services that you could use. You can build your own prediction modeling. You can use third-party services. You can use Gen AI for creatives. You can use it for A/B testing of characters, of backgrounds, of seeing which theme designs work best. So there are a lot of applications of it, 100%.
So, Daniel, we've had more and more guests on the podcast talking about AI, and obviously it has value. And we can see exactly where it would fit into this sort of granularity and customization. But what else is out there that you're paying attention to? Your job is looking beyond the horizon. What else, do you see coming that could have a major impact on this sector?
So it's interesting that there are different, let's say, in gaming and non-gaming, you see different applications. Specifically in the non-gaming world, you see a lot of ideas and notions around using chat AI to build companionship and deeper interactions, right? You have a lot of apps now in the market that do it's companion, it's coaching, it's fitness, it's all these human engagements that you create in an app, whether it's for your physical or mental health, that you can help out with AI. We're seeing a lot of that happening right now in the non-gaming world. In the gaming world, I think AI is predominantly at this point used as an enhancer, let's say, right? It enhances segmentation, it enhances complexity, it enhances, let's say, customization. And to give you an easy example, let's say we talk about ads, right? Ideally, you show ads, and with an ad, there's always a risk. If you show an ad, the user might churn because they don't like ads. So ideally, today, the way you run ads is you say, hey, every 5 minutes I show an ad, right? What if the way we're thinking about ads would be that you predict whether the user's lifetime value is going to be higher if at this moment you show an ad or not, and you only show it if at this moment it is higher, right? So that's a level of complexity that we're getting to now that probably will become reality over the next couple years, I believe, right? So you can build that really, really deeply. I think where we are today, if you ask most gaming companies how they use AI, it is definitely on the creative side. So character building, ad building. Again, because growth is so big for you, right? It's such a key part of a business. Building creatives is also obviously one of the, like, you have your goals, you have your product, and you have your creatives. Those are the three factors that you really impact. And building a high flow of creatives that are high quality used to be pretty costly. You would pay between 500 and 2,000 bucks for a video, 5,000 bucks for a playable. Like, these are not cheap price. Not every studio can afford to just churn out 20 of them a week, right? So lowering of cost, lowering of headcount necessity, and increasing output in creatives has been probably one of the impacts that's most felt today.
One thing I wanted to get to, which is the application of the creative here, Daniel, because before we were hunting whales and we knew what they looked like and we had, the key characteristics, and that there's a whole industry that did that very, very successfully. That's why it's the biggest genre in all the Sensor Tower and data AI reports. I mean, a $2 billion industry. They did really well. But now we're thinking about what's it going to look like in the future, particularly for smaller studios. You know, they want to hunt. They're hunting something very different. I don't know what aquatic creature that's going to be. It's very segmented. It's nearly as segmented as the animal kingdom itself, probably. So, what is the thought here to leave us with something actionable to make the hunt easier?
I think if you're a company developing now, if you're in the business of making games, the truth still always will be that innovation is king. Regardless of the way that you're trying to monetize, if you can take mechanics or you can take tried and tested methods and innovate on them, you will be able to outcompete the market, right? It is an inherently competitive market, so we'll see that when you create something truly new, you will have a pole position there. So regardless of technology, regardless of everything that we've discussed, I still believe that at the core of success in gaming stands the creativity in product design. That's always going to be number one, and you build based of that. So whenever we talk to businesses, I think the feedback that we give them is an understanding of what's realistic, right? What are the expectations that you can have from this genre? How should this genre look? So you know what to overachieve against, right? Um, Obviously, if everyone has a puzzle game that has the same metrics, same looks, same everything, by making the next version of it, you're probably not going to be the winner of the market, right? So you have to innovate, and that's really it's much easier said than done because it's not a foolproof recipe. But we operate in a very mature market. If there was a foolproof recipe, it would have used so much that it's no longer a recipe,
So
right?
did it already. Absolutely.
Exactly. So unfortunately, there is no quick win. There is, I think, a mindset, and I think there is an approach to it that leads to success. But there is no one size fits all.
That's fantastic, Daniel. And sadly, we are running out of time. We'd love to keep you, but we do want to be respectful of your time and our audience as well. So we're going to bring things to a halt, but we will absolutely invite you back at some point in the near future because I think we've only scratched the surface. But before we go, there are two questions we ask all of our guests. The first is, what are you playing right now? What's obsessing you? What's on your phone or what's on your console at home? And the second, favorite game of all time.
I'll be honest with you, historically, I could have used the excuse of doing research to play games. That excuse is no longer valid given the new addition to the family. So my phone time is being somewhat limited. The last game that
I
I
hear you.
ended up doing research on and kind of ended up playing quite a while. And I hate that this is a bit of a self plug, so please apologize. But there's this game called Hexasort, which one of the studios associated with AppLovin's has built. And the reason why I like it is because it's kind of exactly what we said. It used puzzle mechanics in a way that I've never seen before. And that was engaging. Like, I actually just meant to play it for 10 minutes, ended up playing it for an hour or two. So that's a recent game. All time, I would say on console PC, it's been the Max Payne series. I always love these, story-based, short of 10, 12 hours. You really enjoy it. The Last of Us, that type of stuff. On mobile, there was a phase a few years ago where our entire office got very hooked, too much so on PUBG. We would all spend our lunch breaks together on our phones, building a squad, not eating, and instead just playing and trying to win. And I kind of miss those days every now and then. It was a good time.
Well, it was really good to have you, Daniel. I'll second it. We have to have you back. What I really enjoyed, I have to say, is just straightforward talk. There's something about just literally no BS and just talking it through that I find so attractive. And also, a little bit of tough love for everyone out in the audience as well. This is it. Here's how you deal with it, right? We have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And thanks for that.
An absolute pleasure. And we'll welcome you back at some point in the very near future. So,
I hope so.
Daniel Tchernahovsky, thank you so much.
Very good. Very, very good. Thank you, guys. Bye bye.
This show is all about how to do your job better, how to make an amazing game, how to market it, and you have a say. So if you have a story or know someone we need to shine a light on, then we would love to hear from you.
We want to hear from you. We want to reflect the reality of the mobile games market in all its wonderful complexity and strangeness. So if you have any suggestions for us, if you have any feedback for us, you can always get in touch. You can email us at podcast@pocketgamer.biz. You can find us on Twitter @PGBiz, and you can reach out to us through the pocketgamer.biz website. If you're interested in listening to all of our podcasts, you can find them at pocketgamer.biz/podcast. And we would love to hear your thoughts on future shows.
And we've got you covered on all the major platforms. So subscribe to the audio podcast, as Brian said. Look for us on YouTube. If you want to read it, hey, you can do that too, because we have a companion post for you as well on the pocketgamer.biz website.
Tune in again for the next edition of the pocketgamer.biz podcast, and we look forward to speaking to you in the near future.